Today, like I said, we're going to talk about Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. And I'm going to share my screen here because I have a small little presentation here with some fun little graphics to kind of guide us along as we talk about it. Okay. All right. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
You good? Okay, good. All right. So like I said, today we're going to delve into developmental psychology. Essentially, this is what we're going to look at in terms of child psychology. And we're going to start by discussing Jean Piaget, who's a famous Swiss psychologist, and his theory of cognitive development. Okay. So cognitive development is really simply the study of how we acquire the ability to learn. And we'll cover a little bit more about that next week. But he really covers in his theory how we learn, how we think, how we communicate, and how we remember. And theories of cognitive development, they vary in three different ways. Some theories are really staged, and I'll describe that here in the next slide. They assume that development progresses through distinct stages. And remember, we talked about that, I think it was about week 2 or 3. But think, for example, of like the caterpillar turning into a cocoon and then turning into a butterfly. Those are obviously 3 distinct stages, okay? Other theories assume that development progresses continuously, and we talked about that too. Development is sort of like a tree growing gradually and slowly over time without really any distinct qualitative different stages whatsoever. So the next dimension, so we have our stage development and we have our continuous development. The next dimension that we look at, along which theories of cognitive development vary, is that some theories are domain general theories. Now, we haven't really talked a lot about domain general and domain specific, so I'm introducing them here because this kind of highlights, Jean Piaget highlights what domain general theories look like, okay? So what do I mean by this? Well, think about different domains of cognition, domains of thought, if you will. You can think about mathematical reasoning versus linguistic reasoning, language ability versus thinking morally, versus thinking abstract versus thinking concretely. You know, all these are different domains. So some theories assume that domain progresses for each of all of these different domains, as others assume that the domain is specific to each one of those different domains. Now, hopefully I didn't lose you on that. So in other words, that all these domains grow coincidental to each other, okay? As opposed to maybe we can work on language abilities without considering learning, right? So those would be the difference between domain specific and domain general. And last but not least, we have differences between theories in proposed source of learning. Essentially, what causes cognitive development? What underlies really learning over time, okay? But Jean Piaget, he is essentially considered the father of developmental psychology because he developed the first major theory of cognitive development. So where does that fit in terms of the dimensions we discussed in the previous slide? Okay, well, Piaget was the first and foremost stage theorist, as opposed to continuous. He believed that the development passed through distinct stages, and that's really what I'm going to focus on in this presentation. His account was a domain general account, so he believed that regardless of specific domain, it was really all these stages that underlie development, regardless of whether you're talking about math or this or that, right? It was all really lumped into one general domain, okay? It's all just dependent on the stages that we'll talk about here in just a second. And he also believed that, oops, let me go back, oops. He also believed that learning was really experience-based. So he looked at children and how they learned and developed cognitively through their experience of the world. And one of his biggest contribution was viewing children as little scientists, okay? He didn't see children as sort of, you know, these dumb little objects that are just like kind of blobs, you know, going through the world. He really viewed them as little scientists. And and what they do is they experiment on the world in order to understand it better. So something simple like how babies stick toys and objects in their mouths, right? Because we all know that they do that. Some may view that as just a silly little baby thing, but he viewed that as experimentation in their world. A great way to learn about a physical property and new objects is to that you haven't encountered before is to actually put it in your mouth. It's a great way to learn sort of again, right? What properties are like, the texture, the heaviness, and even the taste, all sorts of things. And so he viewed even a simple act as that as experimentation in the world, okay? So let's talk about Jean Piaget's cognitive development theory. Again, it was considered a stage theory, and there were 4 distinct stages that he believed that children pass through universally, regardless of where you're from. So universally, all around the world, not necessarily the universe. We don't know exactly what they're doing up on Mars or Pluto, but we do know what they do as far as humans go. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on is these 4 stages. The first stage that we have is the sensory motor stage. And then we have the pre-operational stage, the concrete operational stage, and then finally, the formal operation stage, okay? So let's look at the first one. We're gonna talk about the sensory motor stage. The sensory motor stage lasts from, I would say about 0 to 2 years of age, okay? And again, when I talk in terms of these ages, like these milestones, right? We're not saying if a child is 3 and he or she has not mastered these stages, that they're significantly deficient in some way, right? It really depends on the upbringing. It really depends on the culture and the exposure, and maybe even the social exposure that child has had as to how quickly they're going to get through these stages, okay? So 0 to 2, rough estimate, not hard, cold science, okay? But anyway, 0 to 2 is what we look at. And it's marked by a focus on the here and now with no thought beyond the immediate physical experiences. That is, children cannot really form mental representations according to Piaget at this stage. Now, I remember learning about mental representations in my introductory psychology class when I was in college, having no idea what it really meant. And I think the best way to illustrate what mental representation means is through an example. So what I want you to do is simply picture your favorite food, okay? Mine is lasagna. I love lasagna, so I'm picturing it in my head. Form a mental image of your favorite food, whatever it looks like, and really create a picture of it in your mind, right? How many of you are able to do that? You can probably even taste it. Like right now, I'm salivating. Now this goes back to Pavlov's dog, classical conditioning. I'm starting to salivate thinking about lasagna. But if you're able to do that and form that, you have that ability to form that mental representation in your head, that's really it, okay? It's being able to hold something in your mind that isn't directly in front of you. Call that image to mind and call that thought to mind and picture it, right? Creating an image of it, even if it's not there, that's mental representation of an object that you're thinking about. And Piaget believed that in sensory motor stage, children really lack that ability. Okay. Man, now I'm hungry for lasagna. It's around lunchtime too. Sorry. Another key limitation of children in the sensory motor stage is that they lack object permanence, and they lack the ability to understand that objects aren't permanent and they continue to exist even when they're hidden from view. Okay, so for example, if you were to take a sensory motor child and you were to take an object and place that object behind a barrier, and the child cannot see through that barrier, the child would be confused, right? That's why peekaboo is so fun for children, because you're gone, and then you decided, then you reappear, and it's magical to them. They're excited about it, right? And that's why they get all giddy, and it's fun for you, and it's fun for them. It's because you disappear from their memory. They don't even have a memory of you until much later, until they're able to understand that things exist, and they return when they disappear. Okay, so the child might think that the object is simply gone it vanished, it no longer exists. And they would really just go about their day and not even think twice about it. This is an illustration that children in this stage lack object permanence. Now, within my course, I have some videos for resources this week that illustrate that and what children that lack object permanence really encounter. And there's some really good newer studies that children might observe object permanence at a much younger age than we initially thought. It just might not be as solidly intact, but they can start developing those concepts much earlier than we thought. Okay, so that's really the sensory motor stage. Any questions so far, or anybody have anything that they want to add? Okay, so now let's focus on the next stage, which is the pre-operational stage. Now, the pre-operational stage is a stage that's lasting from right around 2 to 6 years of age, in which children use words and images to really represent things, meaning that they can form mental representations. Remember, that's what they lacked in the sensory motor stage in the first one. But now they're starting to kind of develop those mental images, those mental representations. And there are two main limitations of children in this stage, in the pre-operational stage. First of all, children in the pre-operational stage, they lack the ability to perform what Piaget called operations. Now, I'm going to describe that in just a moment, but I want to talk about the second one, the second limitation first. So the second one is children are limited by egocentrism, meaning that they view the world from their only point of view, right? This is both a physical and literal thing, okay? Because they think they see, I'm sorry, they think everybody sees what they see, but it's also a conceptual thing. I'm going to give you really an example of this, okay? So when I was in the Air Force, I went on lots of deployments or lots of trips, and my occasionally, quite frequently, actually, I called home to my kids and my wife. And I remember this one time, my daughter was about 4 years old, and I called her on the phone, and my wife let me talk to her, and we were talking about her day and what she was doing, and I asked if mommy was around, and I didn't hear anything. And I said, "Can you put mommy on the phone?" And I didn't hear anything. And then finally, my wife picks up grabs the phone from her and says, "Are you asking her something?" Because she's just standing here shaking her head yes. So that's an example of egocentrism. Okay, so egocentrism for her, she didn't understand that. She did her job. I asked a question, she answered it, because we taught kids you shake your head yes, or you shake your head no, to answer questions, right? So for her, she answered the question. She had no concept that I was not receiving that message, because it was really about her answering that. Another example I like to use for egocentrism is if you ask a child in pre-operational stage what their favorite snack what their favorite snack is, and they say like fruit bites, and you say, "Okay, what do you think my snack is?" So a child in within egocentrism stage, what do you think their answer is going to be? If they like fruit snacks and I ask them what my favorite snack is, what do you think their answer is going to be?
Will be a fruit snack also?
Right, fruit bites, exactly. What do you think they'll say what if I ask them what Michaela's favorite snack is? What do you think they're going to say?
Fruit
Fruit
bites.
bites. Fruit bites, right? They think that everybody has the same preferences as they do, which again is egocentrism. And you can, again, try this on somebody in the pre-operational stage, and chances are you'll find exactly the same thing there. But let's go back to the idea of operations. Sorry, get back to my slide. All right. All right, so within operations, if you, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my, all right. So if you, sorry about that. I'm not able to advance. There we go. Okay. All right. So here's a depiction of one of Piaget's classic tasks. And again, I have videos on D2L that you can watch this yourself and watch it in motion. But the conservation of liquid is probably one of Piaget's most famous tasks. And so what you're looking at is 2 cups, same size, filled with liquid to the same level. And then you see a third cup, right? The third cup, which is really a different size. It's obviously much thinner and taller and longer. And what you do is simple. First, you show the child the two first cups that have the same amount of liquid, and then you simply pour one of those cups into the thinner, longer cup. And then you ask the child, which cup has more liquid? The one on the left or the one on the right, or are they both the same? Hopefully, you as an adult who is hopefully past the pre-operational stage, you would know that they have the same amount of liquid, right? Even the one on the left looks taller. We know that the thinner, we watched as they started putting the same amount of liquid in there, right? Children in the pre-operational stage fail this task. They mistakenly say that the cup on the right has more liquid, demonstrating that they are really indeed in the pre-operational stage, okay? So that would be incorrect. All right, and there are other experiments. I think I have those highlighted in videos as well, with as far as pizza slices. I can use an example with my son who loves pizza. I mean, we're a pizza eating family, but when he was really younger, much younger, probably around the same age, 4 or 5 years old, he used to think the more slices he had, the better off he was. So I remember this one particular case where we had cut my daughter, who was about 1.5 years younger than he was, had cut her pizza up into smaller bites. And we gave him one bigger slice, and he was a little upset. Why would that be? Why would he be upset that he had one bigger slice, even though it's probably the same amount? But why would he be upset with that, do you think?
Because his sister had more pieces.
Right. Yeah, exactly. More pieces. So in his mind, he had more, she had more little pieces than he had one big piece. Even though they were the exact same slice, it looked a little bit different, and therefore he was a little upset with that. Okay. So that's really it for the pre-operational stage. So let's progress onto the concrete operational stage. Okay. The concrete operational stage is a stage that's lasting from about 7 to 11 years of age, roughly, in which children finally understand those concrete events and analogies, meaning they can pass Piaget's conservation of liquid task, as well as the tasks that Piaget devised that were similar, with like the quantity count, right? But in the concrete operational stage, everything is concrete. So they lack in this stage. They're able to, as you can see, they're able to understand conservation there, but what they lack is abstract logic and moral reasoning, right? Which leads us to the final stage in just a second here. But one of the reasons behind that, and if you looked earlier on in the biological makeup of the brain and the development of the brain, is right around 3 or 4 years old, children's brains, for the most part, are formed how they're going to form. And it's just really building from there. What continues to grow over time, well into early adulthood, is the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobe. And what that frontal lobe does for us is what? It helps us with executive decisioning. It helps us with abstract thoughts, right? It helps us with decision making, strategy forming, problem solving, right? Higher emotional functioning and processing. So that's what the prefrontal cortex does. And until it grows to its full capacity, it could be lacking some of those skills, right? And that's why, we might have some issues with teenagers making adult decisions, right? Because they don't necessarily have those moral reasoning skills just yet. They're still forming them through their experiences. So that's one of the reasons behind it, okay? So the last stage that emerges in adolescence, it's about 12 years of age, according to Piaget, which is the formal operation stage, okay? So a stage from 12 years and up, up through early adulthood, adolescence, right? This is where they start to think abstractly. They can start thinking hypothetically, right? So what do I mean by hypothetically? So if we think of a hypothetical situation, similar to what I was asking you to do about, oh my gosh, I'm thinking about lasagna again. Having a mental representation of an object, you're able to have a mental representation of a concept, okay? And that's important, right? One of the counter arguments to why children, I hear a lot of pushback as to why children or why teenagers don't need to learn a second language. A second language is really, really good for the building of these skills, what we would call scaffolding, which we'll cover in Lev Vygotsky on Thursday. But what happens when we ask children to learn multiple languages? Because right out of the gate, as soon as they're born, they start associating images with sounds and written words, right? That's what they do. They start pairing those up. And that becomes a really strong bind for that image versus that word and that sound. So what happens with learning a second language is we are kind of tearing apart that language skill a little bit and reinventing it. So now we have two things that can mean that represent that one image, okay, that one symbol. So very important for that to happen, because that allows them to think a little bit more critically. That allows them to start going into depth a little bit more on the meaning of things, okay? And if you have something that can mean two different things, you're kind of pulling them out of that concrete operational stage and putting them in a formal operational stage, because now they're thinking hypothetically. So that's kind of the reasoning behind that. I get the pushback all the time. Why do we need to learn algebra? Why is that important for us to learn algebra? Algebra probably isn't very applicable in everyday life. However, what it does help with is problem solving skills, mental representation, and hypothetical thinking, right? So even though the actual x equals 2 squared times whatever that is, I didn't do very well in algebra, obviously, but what that does is it helps with applying those concepts to other things, okay? So that's kind of what I mean by hypothetical situations. But they no longer fail concrete operational stages or tasks in this stage. And finally, they can really reason about the hypothetical situations. And I think they start being able to look through moral dilemmas, which is going to be Lawrence Kohlberg's moral development, which I will cover probably a little bit later, and maybe not next week, but the week after. But moral dilemmas are part of that. They've got different stages that they can think. It's not just we don't do things because it's against the rules. We do things for different reasons, right? Maybe it is against the rules and we're going to do it anyway because it's based on survival or whatever. But that's just kind of a glimpse into Lawrence Kohlberg's moral development, okay? So really that's it. That's Piaget's theory in a nutshell. So what are some of the limitations of Piaget? Because it's been around for a long time. He's been doing this for a long time. But because even though we still use his concepts, there is a little bit of criticism and a little bit of limitations to it. Because even though he's, again, the father of developmental psychology, his work spurred on decades of research and even new research even today. And we're going to look at some of those key limitations to Piaget's theory. And we know that some of what he believed was probably a little bit off, okay? And it's important to discover these or talk about these because, as many of you are going out into the field of education or nursing or whatever it is you're going to be doing, you may hear very similar theories to this, but rest assured that they probably came from Piaget's, and here's probably why they're not using Piaget's, right? So the first limitation of Piaget's theory is that development is more continuous than Piaget believed. We're seeing that in research today. And again, I have a video on D2L that highlights that, just some of the most modern work that's going on. As far as we know, and as for most domains, they aren't specific stages that children really pass through. Instead, development progresses gradually over time. Now, there are some exceptions. We have some stages that children pass through when learning to count, for example. All right, so certain aspects of numerical understanding, but overall development is really more continuous than it is staged, okay? Next, we know that his tests, they had really high task demands. So when you lower the task demands, meaning what you're asking of the children, and what do I mean by high task demands, low task demands? High task demands are something that require a lot of mental energy, a lot of mental output, and a lot of focus, right? So if, for example, many of you learn to drive, right? How is learning to drive? Is that a stressful event? Is that a stressful learning process when you're initially doing it? Probably is, right? You got so many things that you're trying to keep track of. You got your gear shifter. If you have a standard, you have to worry about turn signals. You have all these things you have to do. Those are really high task demands. Now, once you do those over time, they become a little bit less stressful, less mentally challenging, right? So when you think of low task demands, those are something that you're used to doing. Those are routines, meaning that, and again, those are asked less of you as far as your mental concentration and focus and attention. But children reveal much deeper understanding that Piaget originally thought, okay, as far as giving them low task demands. Finally, and this is my favorite one, is his entire theory was based on his observation of his 3 children. And I think that's kind of hilarious, right? That he developed such a huge theory that changed the face of psychology and created an entire subdiscipline of psychology, all based on experimentation and observation of his own 3 children. And I think that's pretty kind of cool, okay? So again, that's really all I have with Piaget. Does anybody have any questions or anything that they would like to add? All right, did that help highlight the theory a little bit better for you? Lively crew today. Thanks, Billy, for the thumbs up. All right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop recording.